So this is a paper which, as you can see, has been written by three authors, two from the Paris School of Economics, myself, and Francois Libois, and this is work done jointly with REPOA, and Abel Kinyondo is a co-author of this paper. For the moment, there is no paper, there is a set of slides, but those slides will be soon transformed into a real paper. On the other hand, looking at those three names, I would like to make sure that you don't believe that all the French people are not called Francois. You have two of them here. You know François Mitterrand, you know François Hollande. But I like to simply make the point that Francois Libois there is not even French, he is a Belgian. So, okay, so this paper is essentially about a survey that was recently made in January and February in Tanzania about the way in which people think or feel about the institutional framework in Tanzania, not only or exclusively in connection with industrialization, but in general. And this exercise is part of a much wider program. And what I would like to do to make sure that you understand exactly where we are going, to say a few words about the whole program, and then to focus on this survey and the result that we got from this survey, at least the first result that we got. So a few words about the general program. The program is economic development and institutions. This is a program which is funded by DFID, and the goal of the program is simply to try to improve our understanding of the relationship between institutions and economic development, and the idea being to improve the policy framework in developing countries. This is crucial, and you certainly know that lately very much of the economic literature on development has been focusing on institutions. I think that we understand rather well the economics of development, but what we are not understanding so well is the way in which existing institutions are able, in some cases, not able, in some other cases, to promote the right economics that will lead to development. And this is really an effort to make progress in this area. This is a program which is focusing on low-income countries, which is really focusing more on countries than the kind of cross-country analysis that has been, that can be found in the literature on institutions and development. And the whole program consists of several research activities. One was a complete exhaustive review of the literature on development and institutions. This is something which has been done, and we're in the process of preparing a handbook of institutions and economic development. The second research activity, which I will be talking about today, is called institutional diagnostics, and this is something which is taking place at the country level. The third activity consists of a set of linked randomized controlled trials where we are experimenting with some innovations in the institutional field in various countries of the world, and we are in the process of selecting a first set of randomized controlled trials. And the last activity is about the interactions between institutions, and in particular, and this has been alluded to by my predecessor, on the key issue of the interaction between formal and informal institutions. And to a large extent, one could analyze the development process as a move, progressive move from informal institutions to formal institutions. One word about what is this institutional diagnostics. because this survey is part of it. The idea of this diagnostic is the following. You may know about something called growth diagnostics, which was introduced in the economic literature 10 years ago by Ricardo Hausmann, Danny Roderick, and Andres Velasco. And the idea of growth diagnostic was simply to look at a country and try to identify those economic constraints which were truly binding for the development process. Those constraints which had to be weakened in order for the development process to accelerate. And what we try to do with this activity is really to do the same thing with institutions. Is it possible in a country to analyze the institutional framework in that country, its relationship with development, and to say, this is the kind of institutional reform that would be needed if we want the country to accelerate the process of development or to make the process of development possibly more inclusive or with some different structural features. By institutions, we mean all possible institutions. The definition that was given by my predecessor, referring to Douglas North and others, was absolutely perfect. And those institutions may be in different areas. They may be political, judicial, bureaucratic, property right. It may be many different things. And we expect that in different countries, we will not find the same type of institutions being a constraint on development. The big difficulty that we have in comparison with the growth diagnostics is that we have some ideas about the way in which economic growth is taking place. We know that in order to grow, you have to accumulate human capital, infrastructure, physical capital, that you need to improve productivity, etc., etc. We have a model, and because of that, we are able to start from the model and say, this is a kind of constraint that we may find. In the institutional area, we don't have a model. We cannot say that the way in which an economy is developing over time is with this kind of evolution of the institutions, and if that evolution is not taking place, then the economic process of development will, to some extent, be flawed. We don't have any model of this type. So this means that we really have, in this area, to invent a methodology, and part of the exercise that we are trying to do is to invent the methodology. So what we do, we have a kind of mixture of different approach, and we have decided that we would be testing various approaches to this issue, looking at countries doing case studies, and at the end of this program, within 2 or 3 years, we will look at all the case studies that we'll have done, and we'll see whether we can derive from all those experiences some general conclusions in terms of the way in which we should go if we want to do institutional diagnostics. And it turns out that the first country we are working on, or the pilot study, is Tanzania. This is not by chance. It turns out that the governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania, Benundulu, is part of the scientific advisory committee of our program, and discussing with Beno, it came very quickly, this idea of working on Tanzania. So what is about the Tanzania pilot study? What did we do? What we are intending to do? We do the following. We, of course, have a review of the literature on economics, on institutions, on politics, on history about Tanzania. Then we have analyzed in a very systematic way the implications of the growth diagnostic exercise which took place in Tanzania several years ago, basically in 2011. We had many interviews with top decision makers in Tanzania, and we are summarizing what we learned from all these interviews in terms of what are the institutions particularly important in the case of Tanzania. And we have this survey among decision makers, on which I will be talking a little more in just a moment. And based on this, we will identify themes, institutional areas, which we believe are particularly important in the case of Tanzania, and for which, in each of these themes or areas, we will launch in-depth studies in order to understand better what is behind them. And at the end, we will be drawing the lessons of all this exercise. So we are in the middle of the road, and I will now concentrate on what we learned and what we did with this survey. Okay, so this Tanzanian country institutional survey, the goal was essentially to have decision makers in various areas of economic activity and political activity to reveal what they believed were the strengths and the weaknesses of the institutional framework in Tanzania. This procedure had 3 steps. This was through questionnaires. And we selected, and I'll come back to the sample in just a moment, 100 respondents. And each one of them was submitted a questionnaire. And the questionnaire consisted of various sets of questions grouped by themes, basically because if we had asked all the questions to every respondent, it would have taken a very, very long time, and we wanted to save on the time and the patience of our respondents. So the idea was to propose to every respondent a list of 10 institutional areas and to have them choose 3 of them which you believe are particularly important, and even give them a weight in terms of importance, and you will be answering the questions within those clusters of questions. And then, in order to make sure that all the clusters would be responded at one point or another, we asked them to respond to another cluster of questions, which was selected in a random way. And finally, we also had them to start to openly say, I like the questionnaire, but I believe that you are missing this point. You are not talking about this issue, which is quite important, and I would like to say a little more about that issue. Or, because the questionnaire, of course, was taking place at a time, there might be a change in the institutional framework in Tanzania. We also asked people whether their answers were very much affected by what was in the news at the time they were answering the questions, or whether the answers corresponded to something which was structural of the Tanzanian economy and society. The questionnaire was adapted from a well-known questionnaire called the Institutional Profile Database, which has been run in many countries in the world, with a big difference is that in general those questionnaires are run with experts. In our case, we are running a questionnaire with people whom we could consider users of institutions rather than experts of institutions, and we believe that this is making a big difference. So the questionnaire was administered on tablets. It was run by REPOA with the help of OPM in Tanzania, and I'll get into more detail now. These are the various clusters. 10 clusters, very standard definition: political institutions, law and order, functioning of public administrations, etc., etc. Now, every cluster came with a set of questions. What is quite important is that some questions appeared in various clusters. For example, we could very well have questions about land rights in the cluster about land rights, but also in the cluster about doing business. Because in order to do business, you need to handle land, and the question was appearing in both. I'm sorry about this slide, because it is really fine print. It's like in your, when you read your policy, your insurance policy. But there were many, many questions, and I simply take a picture of part of the questionnaire. But, and I'm even not able to read exactly what is there. But for example, the first question would be on the political institutions. Are you satisfied with the way in which the electoral system work? Then you had some question on the capacity of the state. Then some question about the land and the local communities, about the facility of acquiring land to do some operations. And you see that all the questions are coming with a Likert scale, where people are being asked, what do you think, or to what extent do you think that this statement is true? And then they say, not at all, a little, moderately so, much, and very much. So basically, and then we use those answers. We use a 1 to 5 scale, and we use that scale to measure the degree of adherence of people to one specific statement here. And of course, there was a possibility for people to say that they didn't want to answer, or they had no idea, and of course there are no responses. This column doesn't appear there. Okay, what about the sample? The sample, as I said before, is about decision makers. By decision makers, we mean people whose occupation is to make decisions, but in many different areas. It may be in politics, it may be in the bureaucracy, it may be in business, it may be in academia, it may be in the media, it may be in the army, it may be in the NGOs, it may be in religious organizations, it may be in many, many different fields. And there was no sampling procedure, in the sense that we didn't have any representative, we didn't have any census of that population, and we could not get a representative sample, but we tried as much as possible to diversify the sample. We limited the sample to 100 people, basically because of resource constraints, but we are now considering the possibility maybe of extending the questionnaire and to go through internet, but this is something that we have not yet decided, and this is raising other questions of selection that we have not solved for the moment. So I will simply be referring to the result that we got with this 100 sample. So this sample is not representative of any particular segment of society, but it is very, very diversified, and you see why and how in just a moment. And again, I would like to insist on the fact that this is, in this area, first experience of this type where people who are interviewed as users of institutions more than implementers or experts, and this is something which is new. So this is the final composition of the sample. Again, maybe difficult to read from where you are, but at the top you have government people, then you have bureaucrats, then you have people representative of NGOs and development NGOs, then you have donors and international organizations, business people, etc. And you see that you have a rather obvious diversity of people. At the middle, you have some sectors of activity. And on the right-hand side, you have the location of those people. So we had many people from Dar, but we also had people interviewed in Dodoma, in Arusha, in Mwanza, in Mbeya. So we tried also to diversify from that point of view. And we also tried to diversify in terms of gender. This is another breakdown of the sample, 101 respondents, and I don't remember where the one is coming from, because there was 100 in the first slide, in the previous slide, but then now there is 101. I believe the one is a pilot whom we interviewed right at the beginning. So you have people mostly from Tanzania, of course, but we interviewed diplomats and we interviewed also donors, which are not Tanzanian. 83 males, 17 females, people mostly in urban areas, people married, having children, university degree. Most of the people, of course, were with a rather high level of education. Several of them studied abroad. And so this gives you an idea about the kind of people who are there. Many people were involved in politics, 34. Now the point is that we also ask people about what they did in the past. So what you have on this slide is, so for example, you have 37 people in business, when as a matter of fact there were only, if I remember well, 10 people in the business sector today. But many people went through the business sector at some point of their life, which meant that when they were answering questions about business, they knew, because at some stage of their life, they had this kind of experience. Same thing with politics. We had people who were in politics, who were not anymore in politics, but had been in politics at some point of time. So it is quite important to take into account the fact that people have more experience than what their present occupation is. So now let's get to the crux of the matter with the first cut at the result. These are the various clusters which were chosen by the people. And you can see that there are 4 of them which are quite important, and there are essentially the blue one on the left is the political institutions. Then the next one is the judicial system, law and order, and justice and security. The green one is public administration, and the yellow one is ease of doing business. Then we have 3 clusters which are a little less important. One is the gray one is about land. The red one is about the long-term vision and strategic planning in the state. The blue one is about market regulation. And then we have this cluster, which we were very surprised, which had very little success. Nobody wanted to answer that set of questions, which was about security of transactions and contracts. And afterward, we believe that maybe we had a problem of vocabulary, and simply people were a bit afraid that they would not understand the kind of questions behind that, maybe because it would be too much an issue of lawyer rather than of the layman. But definitely there was an issue from that point of view. Fortunately, as I said before, the questions in that cluster are also found in other clusters, so that we didn't miss too much with that. And the last 2 ones are the relationship with the rest of the world, and social cohesion, social protection, and solidarity. So very clearly there is very much importance given to political, public administration, business, and justice. But we'll see that there are, interestingly enough, some differences. Let me go directly to that. Some differences between those, this importance that people gave to those various areas and the importance they gave through the answers to the questions. And what is interesting is that the answers to specific questions are not necessarily consistent with the weights assigned by respondents to the clusters. In particular, and I think this is something which is quite important, it turns out that land issues were given a huge importance by all the people who came across questions about land. And this is in complete contradiction or differences with what we had in the previous slide, where we could see that questions about land were not really considered as important by respondents a priori. And I think this is interesting that it is when people are in front of questions that they realize that how important it is. Some of the themes that come out of the questions and the way in which people answer the questions are cross-cutting the various clusters that I've shown. One very important issue, of course, is corruption. Now, the problem with corruption, and this is something which has been said yesterday repeatedly, is that corruption is more a symptom of institutions which are not working well. It is not an institution per se. And because of that, it is not that easy to analyze or to handle the issue of corruption in this setting. As I said before, the semantics may matter. And it is also interesting that some clusters deemed important, but at the same time, they were important, but people didn't say very much about whether there are those clusters were very weak or whether they had something very specific to say about them. But let me show you more systematically the result that we get. The methodology is very simple. We took all the questions. We said, there were negative questions and positive questions. So a negative question would be, do you think that the electoral system is working correctly? Or this would be a positive question. A negative question, the same question, would be, do you think that the electoral system is flawed? Or that elections are rigged? So it was important to make sure that in the way in which we consider or we mark each question, we mark them in the same way, meaning that we mark them between 1 and 5, and meaning that 5 is the most positive answer and 1 is the most negative answer. Now, we then rank all the questions by descending order of disagreement. And what I will be showing here is only the question for which the answers were extremely negative and the question for which the answers were extremely positive. And what is interesting is that there are many questions which are extremely negative, and there are almost no questions which are extremely positive. And I believe that it is an interesting outcome of this thing. Now, here are the 10 major weaknesses. I will not go through all of them. I will simply read the first ones. So if I look at the first question with major weakness, how frequent are land-related conflicts? And people said these are extremely frequent. The mark for that question is 1.6, so this means that it is really the bottom of the Likert scale. And the 90% that you see there is the fact that 90% of the people answered 1 or 2, answered it is terrible or it is close to terrible. And practically nobody said it is average or it is good. And if you look at the second question, how large would you say the degree of corruption is between citizens and the administration? Same thing, 1.6 would be the average mark, 86% of the people considering that things were definitely very, very bad. And if you look at the last question in this list, which said, to what extent do you think that the slow development of utilities, electricity, is due to the inefficient regulation of these sectors, then again, you still have 83% of the people who considered that regulation in these areas are really extremely bad. And even when we go to the 40 major weaknesses, we find that there is a very, very strong majority. We have a consensus on the fact that these are things which are not working. Now, I will not go through those 41. Here you have I regrouped the 40 questions into various themes. Dominant themes are corruption, land, or if I, this is in terms of degree of weakness. So it is a mean evaluation. They are ranked by the average mark. Corruption, land, lack of state autonomy. Some others, I will not get into the detail of that. Regulation, ease of doing business, and state coordination. And if you want to have a little more detail on what is behind that, in this slide we give a little more. For example, about corruption, we have the different types of corruption between administration and citizen, between administration and friend and local business, political, vote buying, illegal, hidden campaign financing, bribes, etc. For land, the frequency of land-related conflicts, corruption in land operations, the insecurity of land tenure, inequality of land distribution, etc. So we have some detail on each one of those areas which are deemed to be weak in the case of Tanzania. And we have that for several of them. Now, because time is short, now I have to hurry and maybe get close to the conclusion. This chart is, I believe, particularly interesting. It shows the share of the various clusters, the 10 clusters that I've shown at the beginning, in the total number of questions which were asked, or which were in the questionnaire. This is in red. And in blue, you have the share of those 10 clusters in the top 40 weaknesses that were noted or revealed by the respondents. And you see that in some cases, there is a huge difference between the blue bar and the red bar. And in particular, for at the middle, you have this big difference between the blue bar and the red bar, which correspond to land. And this means that in terms of the clusters, land is the cluster where the evaluation of institutions was definitely the worst in comparison with the other clusters. So from that point of view, we can see here that we have some relevant information revealed by the survey. Here are the major subjects of satisfaction. Because of time, I will not go through all of them. They are rather diverse, and you may not be surprised to see that the most obvious subject of satisfaction is a sense of Tanzanian identity, the security of persons, the effectiveness of the state in controlling police. So these are things that we are expecting. But as I said at the beginning, what is quite interesting is the fact that there are very few cases, even in that list, where the answers are completely concentrated in the top two best evaluations, 4 and 5. In the case of the weaknesses, we consider that the weakness was an average mark below 2, and symmetrically, we should have said the good the subject of satisfaction are the questions for which the mean mark would be above 4, but there was none of them for which we had more than 4. So it is quite interesting to see that there is less consensus on the satisfaction than on the dissatisfaction. Okay. So some final remarks on the interpretation to be given to this survey. The results I've shown are about extreme satisfaction and dissatisfaction. This is interesting. But I think it is also important to keep in mind that the fact that some other themes were not found to be very satisfactory or very unsatisfactory is also something that we have to take into account. For example, what should we say with the following result? We say that less than 25% of the respondents believe that the electoral process is not flawed? What should we do of the fact that less than 25% of the respondents find that the deviation from the budget are properly discussed? These are things which we might expect to be leading to some kind of consensus. And there is no consensus on that. Meaning that certainly in those areas which are a little gray in comparison with the two sets of satisfaction and dissatisfaction, even there is some reason to think about what all this means. Now, the fact that we have only 6% of the question with a score higher than 3.5, none with a score higher than 4 is worrying. And the problem is to know exactly now how we want to interpret those results, and in particular, what to do with this middle ground of answers. One important issue, which we don't have really time to get very much into, but which I believe is important, is the issue of respondent heterogeneity. Responses may very much be influenced by who the respondents are. Let's take, for example, the case of gender. There were various questions about gender, and for example, we would expect that more women than men consider that there is discrimination, gender discrimination in the labor market. And in some cases, this means that when we look at the average, we are really missing something. So, because I cannot use those arrows, let me switch to that. Here you have a very interesting case. The question is, to what extent do you think that the state discriminates among gender in the access of citizens to justice? The blue corresponds to male. The red corresponds to female. And you see that there is a consensus of males saying that no discrimination among gender in the access to justice. And there is a consensus among women about a lot of discrimination against women in the access to justice. Now, it is important to take into account that heterogeneity. Now, it may be the case that this reflects a bias in the way in which people think about those institutions. But it may also be the case that there is truly a discrimination which is not seen by one part of the respondents. Now, we have the same kind of analysis with people who are saying that they are more on the side of the opposition rather than the side of the ruling party. So this is a kind of analysis that we could make. The only problem that we have 100 respondents, so we have very little statistical power to do that. So let me get to the end with provisional lesson from this exercise. At this stage, the message delivered by this survey, but again, I insist on the fact that this is only one of the tools that we will be using in our diagnostic exercise. But the main message are that the weak institutions in Tanzania are linked to land rights, to corruption, but we have to take into account, as I said before, that corruption is a symptom much more than an institutional weakness, and we have to identify or to make sure that we are looking at the institutions generating corruption rather than corruption itself. Regulation of utilities, regulation of competition, regulation of prices for agriculture, for small farmers. These are very, very important issues, and again, a consensus on those, on the weakness of these institutions. State coordination, many people pointing to the fact that there are lack of coordination in the way in which the state system works, lack of autonomy of the state, in the sense that big business, foreign investors, donors, international organizations may be too powerful in influencing the decision made by the government, and ease of doing business. But again, I believe that this is more a symptom than a cause. So this diagnostic is not inconsistent with other diagnostic tools that we have been using. like governance indicators, as they were mentioned in the previous presentation, but this definitely requires further analysis. So I will stop here. This is work in progress. We will have still work to do in exploiting those data. In particular, we have to exploit the open questions, which I've not said anything about. And again, this is one piece of the whole construction that we have in trying to generate this diagnostic on institutions in Tanzania. And I hope that within a few months, I'll be able to be back to this kind of, in front of this kind of audience to present more definite answers and conclusions. Thank you very much.